The call came on a Wednesday morning, 4 days after my retirement dinner. I was at my kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, looking out at the little patch of yard behind the house. The grass still held a bit of dew. My late wife's bird feeder moved lightly in the breeze, and a pair of sparrows kept dropping in and out of it like they owned the place. I had told myself that retirement would begin with mornings like that. Quiet ones. No rushing. No decisions before noon. No one needing something from me before I'd even finished breakfast. Then my phone buzzed across the wood. I almost let it go. The screen showed Melissa. She had run my office for 23 years. Long enough to know how I took my coffee, how I signed checks, how to tell from the way I opened a door whether I was in a good mood or carrying a problem I hadn't named yet. She had come to work for me back when my first location was still in a patched-up building on the south side of Knoxville, when my wife was alive, when my daughter was in braces, and my son still spent Saturday mornings in a baseball cap too big for his head. I picked up. She didn't waste words. "I need to talk to you." Her voice was steady, but too careful. I said, "I'm retired now, remember?" "I know," she said. "Not on the phone. Can you come in?" There was a pause. I could hear a copier running somewhere behind her. A door closing. Then nothing. That was what made me listen. Over the years, I had heard that exact quiet in her voice when something was wrong. Not dramatic wrong. Not panic. The other kind. The kind that came with paperwork. Missing inventory. A vendor dispute. A number that didn't match another number. Melissa never got loud. She got precise. I looked back out at the feeder. One of the sparrows had flown off. The other stayed. "I'll be there by 10, I said. "Thank you," she said, and hung up. I put the phone face down. For a minute or two, I just sat there with my hand around the coffee mug, feeling the warmth in the ceramic and listening to the refrigerator hum. Retirement had lasted 4 days. That wasn't much of a run. Still, I got up, rinsed the cup, and went to change. The drive to the store took 22 minutes if traffic behaved, and that morning it did. I took the same route I'd taken for years, past the gas station on Chapman Highway, past the diner where the church crowd gathered on Sundays, past the small brick bank where I'd signed more loan documents than I cared to remember. The sky was pale and flat, the kind of fall morning that never fully decides to warm up. I parked in the side lot out of habit. The store looked the same as it always had. Contractor trucks near the loading area. Shopping carts crooked near the entrance. A pallet of bagged mulch still sitting out front because somebody had forgotten to move it before the dew came in. I stood there for a second with my keys in my hand and had the odd feeling that I had left one version of my life on Saturday night and stepped right back into it on Wednesday morning without anybody asking me first. Inside, the air smelled like cut lumber, dust, and machine oil. Familiar enough that my shoulders shifted before I noticed it. A radio was playing low near the registers. One of the younger cashiers gave me a quick smile and said, "Morning, Mr. Dalton," before remembering I wasn't supposed to be Mr. Dalton in charge anymore. I nodded and kept walking. Past plumbing, past electrical, down the side aisle with the stacked ladders and boxed ceiling fans. Then through the door at the back marked office in peeling black letters. Melissa was behind her desk. She had a mug of tea in front of her, untouched. Her reading glasses were folded beside a yellow legal pad. She looked as if she had slept in fragments. When she saw me, she stood, then sat back down almost immediately, like she'd thought better of making this any bigger than it already was. "Close the door," she said. I did. The office seemed smaller than usual with the door shut. The fluorescent light had that faint buzz old fixtures get. I could hear a forklift somewhere outside, backing up in short beeps. Melissa reached over, picked up her phone, and placed it on the desk between us. "I need you to let me finish before you say anything," she said. I sat across from her. "All right." She took a breath. "At your dinner on Saturday, I stepped into the side hall to call my sister back. The banquet room door wasn't all the way shut. She stopped there. Her eyes stayed on mine, making sure I was with her. I looked at the phone on the desk, then back at her. "And," I said. She swallowed once. "I heard your son and your daughter talking." Something in me went still. Not angry. Not yet. Just still. Outside the office, somebody laughed near the register area. A hand truck rattled over the concrete. Normal sounds. Morning sounds. The kind that keep going whether your life is changing or not. Melissa rested her fingers lightly on the phone. "I didn't mean to overhear it," she said. But after the first minute, I realized I needed to keep listening. I didn't speak. She glanced down at the screen, then back at me. There's more. And I think you need to hear it exactly the way I heard it. She turned the phone so it faced me. Then I waited. Melissa pressed play, then leaned back and folded her hands in her lap like she didn't trust herself to touch anything else. I won't repeat every word I heard that morning. Some of it still sits in me in a way I'd rather not handle line by line. But I understood enough before the recording was over, and I understood it clearly. The voices were my son's and my daughter's. There was restaurant noise underneath them. Dishes. A door opening and closing somewhere close by. Somebody laughing too loudly down the hall. Their voices were low, but not low enough. What struck me first was how unsurprised they sounded about my retirement. Not curious. Not concerned. Not even relieved. Prepared. My daughter said she had been nudging me for months. That was the word she used. Nudge. She said she'd been bringing up how tired I looked, how long I'd been doing this, how I deserved to slow down, how maybe it was time to let go of more than just day-to-day operations. I had heard all of those comments over the past year and taken them at face value. A daughter being thoughtful. A daughter noticing age in her father before he was ready to name it himself. On that recording, I heard the shape of it more clearly. It had not been concern. It had been placement. One brick at a time. My son's part was different. Less polished. More direct. He had been living in my house for a little over 2 years by then, along with his girlfriend, in the back bedrooms that had once been meant for guests and, later, for family at holidays. The arrangement had started after a layoff. That much was true. He had called me in a bad stretch, embarrassed and tired, and I had said, "Come stay for a while." A while turned into months. Then a year. Then something that was never discussed plainly enough to end. He paid for little. Sometimes groceries. Rarely anything else. The electric bill kept climbing. The water bill did too. His car sat under my carport. His laundry moved through my machines. His shoes by the back door became part of the picture of my house, so gradually I stopped seeing them. On the recording, he talked about my house in a tone I knew immediately and hated quietly. He spoke as though it was already passing into his hands. He mentioned the market. He mentioned what the property would probably sell for if it was listed in the spring instead of the fall. He mentioned equity. He mentioned timing. He asked my daughter whether she thought I'd resist if it came to paperwork. Paperwork. That was the word that made me look away from Melissa's phone and toward the office wall, where an old framed photo of the first store still hung crooked from one nail. Because now I understood this was not two grown children idly speculating after a family dinner. This was a conversation that had already taken form somewhere else. Then my daughter said, "He won't fight it. He trusts us." She didn't say it warmly. She said it like a useful fact. I remember hearing the air vent kick on in that office. I remember the smell of dust lifting slightly from it. I remember the scrape of my own thumbnail along the seam of the chair arm. Little details. The mind takes hold of strange things when it is trying not to move too fast. Then my son said something about a doctor. Not my doctor. Not anyone I knew. A friend of a friend, he said. Somebody who knew how these things worked. Somebody who had explained the general process of getting an older parent evaluated if there were signs. My son listed a few. Misplacing keys. Repeating stories. Grief after losing my wife. Emotional decisions. Fatigue. Then he used the word competency. He used it casually. That was almost worse than anything else. Not because I didn't know what the word meant. I did. I had dealt with business law, estate planning, insurance arguments, bank covenants, and more than one ugly dispute over the years. I understood exactly what that word could start if somebody pushed it in the right room with the right paperwork. What I hadn't expected was to hear my own son use it like he was discussing weather. The recording ended a few seconds later. Melissa stopped it and set the phone down on the desk. Neither of us spoke right away. Outside the office, life kept moving. A customer somewhere near hardware asked whether we had a certain kind of faucet cartridge in stock. A printer in the front area started spitting out paper. I heard the automatic doors slide open and shut as someone came in from the parking lot. Inside that room, everything felt very still. Melissa finally said, "I'm sorry." I shook my head once. "No," she waited. "You did the right thing," I said. My voice sounded normal to me. That surprised me a little. I stood up, then sat back down again. Not because I was unsure what I'd heard. Because I already knew that if I left too quickly, I'd be driving while my mind was still trying to catch up to itself. Melissa picked up her tea, then set it back down without drinking. I didn't know what else to do. There wasn't anything else to do. She nodded, but she still looked troubled. Loyal people carry things hard. Melissa had always been that way. She could deliver bad news cleanly, but she still felt the weight of being the one to hand it over. I asked her, "Have you told anyone?" "No, good." She gave a small nod. I looked at the phone again. "Send me a copy?" She hesitated. "I can, but I wanted to ask first." "Don't send it yet," I said. "Not until I talk to an attorney." That seemed to settle something in her. "Okay." I stood this time and stayed standing. At the door, I stopped and turned back. Melissa was looking down at the legal pad on her desk, though I could tell she wasn't reading a word on it. "Melissa." She looked up. "Thank you." Her expression changed then, just a little, enough to show that she had been bracing herself for something worse. I left the office and walked back through the store slowly, past the shelves of drill bits, past the paint counter with the dried color charts curling at the corners, past the seasonal display by the entrance, where someone had put out plastic mums in dull orange pots that looked almost convincing if you didn't get too close. I could feel people greeting me, nodding at me, speaking to me, and I answered as needed, but I couldn't have told you afterward exactly what anyone said. The parking lot air was colder than I expected. I got in the truck and shut the door, and for a minute I just sat there with both hands on the wheel. I thought about my daughter at 9 years old, standing on a chair to help my wife stir brownie batter. I thought about my son at 12, asleep in the back seat after a baseball tournament, red dirt still on his socks. I thought about the years in between, driver's licenses, tuition, weddings, bailouts dressed up as help, long talks that should have been firmer than they were. I am not a man who believes every family disappointment appears out of nowhere. Even sitting there with that recording fresh in my ears, I knew enough to understand I had helped build some of the conditions that made it possible. Not the decision itself. That was theirs. But the soft landings, the second chances, the habit I had of stepping in before discomfort had done its work. My wife had seen that clearly long before I did. She used to tell me, "You confuse rescue with love." At the time, I thought she was being hard. Sitting in that truck, I could hear her voice so plainly it was almost like she was in the passenger seat. I drove home by the long route instead of the fast one, past the neighborhood where the kids had grown up, past the brick elementary school with the chain-link fence around the playground, past the church where my daughter got married, past the little league fields where my son once hit a ball so hard down the third base line I stood up and shouted before I even realized I was doing it. Those places were still there. That was the strange part. The map of my life hadn't moved. Only the understanding of it had. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had stopped feeling stunned. Not better, just clearer. The house was quiet when I went in. My son was out. His girlfriend too. Their shoes were by the back door, though. A jacket over the chair in the breakfast room. A half-empty bottle of sports drink on the counter. Evidence of people living lightly inside someone else's structure and calling it normal. I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the bird feeder. Then I started thinking in order. Step 1, I needed legal protection around everything that mattered. Step 2, I needed to understand exactly what my children could and could not touch. Step 3, I needed to say nothing until all of it was done. That last part mattered most. Silence is useful when you are hurt, but only if you use it carefully. Otherwise it turns into avoidance, and I had done enough avoiding in my life where my children were concerned. This was different. This was silence with a purpose. I went upstairs to my study, closed the door, and took out the folder where I kept my estate documents. The paper had that dry, stiff feel legal documents always have. My wife's old will was still in there, along with the revised trust paperwork from after she passed. I laid everything out on the desk in neat stacks. Property deed, business ownership documents, insurance records, prior estate notes. I made a list on a yellow pad in block letters. Estate attorney, accountant, corporate structure, property rights, medical evaluation. I underlined the last one once. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney's office. Her receptionist answered on the second ring. I gave my name, and before I had even finished asking whether there might be any way to get in that week, she said, "Hold on, Mr. Dalton. Let me see if she can move something." I waited with the phone against my ear, looking down at my handwriting on the legal pad. The house was so quiet I could hear the clock in the hallway. Then the receptionist came back on the line and said, "She can see you tomorrow morning at 9:30. I said I'd be there. Then I hung up, put the phone face down, and looked at the papers spread across the desk. After a moment, I opened the drawer where I kept my wife's old fountain pen, took it out, and set it beside the pad. Then I waited. The next morning I left the house before my son came downstairs. That wasn't an accident. I had no interest in starting a conversation before I knew exactly what needed to be protected and how. The kitchen was still dim when I came through it. The coffee maker gave its last little hiss as it finished. Outside, the air had that cold, dry edge East Tennessee gets in late October, where the light looks clean but never quite warm. I poured coffee into a travel mug, took one piece of toast I didn't really want, and went out through the garage. My attorney's office was in a brick building near downtown. 3 floors, narrow lobby, polished handrail on the staircase that had been there long enough to shine in the center. I had been there before, twice with my wife and once after she passed, so nothing about the place surprised me. Same neutral carpet, same lamp in the waiting room, same bowl of wrapped peppermints on the side table no one ever seemed to eat. Her assistant greeted me by name and said, "She'll be right with you." I sat down and looked at a framed print on the wall of an old courthouse. A couple came out of one of the side offices speaking in low voices. Somewhere farther back, a copier ran for a few seconds and stopped. Then Laura opened the door and said, "Come on in, Frank." She had handled estate work for us for years. Mid-50s, direct, no wasted movement. She was one of those people who could make a room feel calmer just by being the one in it who understood the system best. Once the door was shut behind me, she didn't start with small talk. "You said urgent," she said. "What's going on?" I handed her my phone. "I need you to listen to something." She put on her reading glasses, settled back in her chair, and listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't change much while it played. That was one of the things I appreciated about her. She never performed surprise for the client's benefit. But I could see the shift in her eyes midway through. Not shock exactly. Assessment. When the recording ended, she took off the glasses and folded them carefully on the desk. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you want to happen." That was the right question. Not how are you feeling? Not how bad is this? Not are you sure? Just, what outcome are we building toward? I had spent enough of the night thinking to answer cleanly. I want my estate secured. I want the business secured. I want the house secured. I want it documented clearly that I'm making these decisions on my own, with full capacity, and I want to close off anything they might try to do using age or confusion or pressure. She nodded once. Good. That's specific. Then she turned a yellow legal pad toward herself and started writing in neat lines. For the next hour, we went piece by piece. Some parts were simpler than I had feared. The stores were solely mine. I had never formally transferred ownership interests to either child, never added them to operating agreements, never promised anything in writing beyond broad family talk over holiday dinners and the kind of vague future language people use when they don't want to deal with hard things in the present. Legally, vague family talk is worth exactly what it ought to be worth, which is very little. The house was simpler too. It was mine, free and clear, title clean, no added names, no side agreements, no borrowings against it other than one old line of credit I had closed years before. My prior estate plan, though, needed work, not because it was invalid, because it reflected assumptions that no longer match reality. Laura explained the options the way good attorneys do, with no drama and no lecture. A revised will, a revocable trust, specific distributions, conditions around management, successor trustees who were not family, clear medical and financial powers of attorney, documentation showing contemporaneous legal review and updated intent. She went through what could be challenged, what was hard to challenge, what tended to invite ugly fights, and what usually shut them down before they got traction. I asked questions when I needed to. If I reduce what they inherit, can that be contested on the basis that I was influenced? It can always be attempted, she said. That doesn't mean it succeeds. If they try to push a competency claim, then we create a record now that makes that claim very expensive and very weak. She tapped her pen once against the pad. I'd like you to get a formal cognitive evaluation from a physician with no connection to your family, she said. Not because I think you need one. Because if someone is already talking this way, I prefer documents to opinions. That made sense to me immediately. There is a particular comfort in process when emotion has become unreliable. Process is boring. It is also useful. By the time we were done, my mind had shifted fully out of hurt and into order. I remember looking out her office window at the parking lot below and noticing a man loading bankers' boxes into the trunk of a gray sedan. Just an ordinary weekday scene. Work being moved from one place to another. Things put in containers and labeled. There was something steadying about that. Laura pulled a clean sheet from her pad and turned it toward me. "I want you to think about this in sequence," she said. "First, we revise the estate documents. Second, we establish independent proof of capacity. Third, if you want changes regarding anyone living in your home, we handle that separately and properly. Fourth, once everything is signed, all communication goes through paper, not emotion." I looked at the list. She said, "Can you do it that way?" "Yes." "Good." It may sound strange, but that was the moment I started feeling better. Not happy, not relieved. Better in the way a room feels better once somebody opens the blinds and you can finally see where everything is. The facts had not improved. My children had still said what they'd said, but confusion had begun to leave the building. Before I left, Laura asked, "Do you want to preserve the recording?" "Yes." "Then don't edit it. Don't forward it around casually, and don't mention it to anyone who doesn't need to know. If we ever need an affidavit or chain of custody discussion, less handling is better." I nodded. At the door, she said, "Frank, one more thing." I turned back. "This is personal, so I'm going to say it plainly. You don't have to decide today what kind of father you want to be emotionally. You only have to decide what needs to be protected legally. Those are separate questions." I stood there for a second with my hand on the knob. "That helps," I said. I thought it might. From there I drove straight to my accountant's office. Harold had been doing my business taxes for 15 years. He occupied a suite above a dental practice in a beige office park that smelled faintly of copier toner and old carpet. He wore the same kind of button-down shirt every day of his life, pale blue or white, and kept sharpened pencils lined up with almost military neatness beside his keyboard. When I told his receptionist I needed time that day, she looked over his schedule and said, "He can give you 30 minutes if you can wait." "I can wait." I sat in one of the lobby chairs and watched the second hand on the wall clock move around 3 full times before Harold came out himself and said, "Come on." He shut the door, sat down, and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. What happened? I hadn't told him anything on the phone beyond saying I needed to review asset structure and transfer exposure. That kind of language gets an accountant's attention, so I gave him the practical version. My retirement was recent. My children had begun speaking as though certain property and business interests were effectively theirs. I needed a clean review of every major asset, every transfer risk, every tax consequence of revision, and every place where informal expectations might create confusion later if not addressed now. Harold listened the way accountants do, with no visible emotion and total focus. When I finished, he asked the only question that mattered first. "Have you already promised them anything in writing?" "No." "Good." Then he swiveled to his computer and started opening files. Tax returns, entity structures, depreciation schedules, real estate basis, prior gift exclusions. A long trail of my working life compressed into columns and tabs. Harold was not a man who rushed to comfort, and I appreciated that. Comfort wouldn't help me. Clean numbers would. For nearly an hour, he walked me through what sat where, what could be moved, what should stay untouched, what revisions could create unnecessary tax drag, and what trust structure would preserve flexibility while keeping management authority exactly where I wanted it. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and said, "From a numbers standpoint, this is manageable." I said, "And from another standpoint?" He looked at me for a long second. "From another standpoint, I'm sorry." I nodded once. That was enough. He printed several summaries and clipped them together. As he handed them to me, he said, "Whatever you do, do it formally. No side conversations. No handshakes. No, we'll work it out later." That's the plan. Good. By the time I got back to my truck, the morning had thinned toward noon. Sunlight had warmed the windshield enough that the cab felt stuffy when I first got in. I set the packet from Harold on the passenger seat, then the folder from Laura on top of it. Paper on paper. That was how I had built most of my life, if I was honest. Not with speeches. With ledgers, purchase orders, tax filings, lease terms, receipts, signatures, dates, quiet systems that held because somebody had taken the time to make them hold. I sat there with both hands on the wheel and understood, maybe later in life than I should have, that this would be no different. Love had made me imprecise. Paper was going to have to correct that. When I got home, my son's car was in the driveway. His girlfriend's laughter drifted faintly from the den through an open window. A television was on somewhere inside, too loud for the middle of the day. I sat in the truck for a moment longer, then gathered my folders and went in through the front door instead of the garage so I'd have a minute before anyone saw me. The house smelled like reheated food and laundry detergent. My son came out of the kitchen as I was heading toward the stairs. He had a plate in one hand, phone in the other. He looked relaxed, comfortable, like a man in a place arranged around his ease. "Hey," he said, "you were out early. I had appointments." He nodded toward the folder under my arm. "Retirement keeping you busy already?" He meant it lightly, maybe even kindly. That was the hard part. Most betrayals do not arrive wearing a villain's face. They arrive wearing the same face that asks if you want the last biscuit at dinner. "Something like that," I said. He shifted the plate to his other hand. "You want me to pick anything up later? We're heading out around 6. "No," I said. "I'm fine." He gave a small shrug and went back toward the kitchen. I went upstairs, closed my study door, and laid everything out again in fresh stacks. Attorney notes on the left, accountant summaries on the right, my own legal folder in the center. Then I took a clean legal pad and wrote the next sequence. Revise estate documents. Schedule medical evaluation. Review occupancy rules for house. Update powers of attorney. No discussion until signed. I underlined the last line twice. Then I called the physician Laura had recommended, the one with experience in elder assessment and no connection to my family, and asked for the earliest opening. The receptionist told me the doctor could see me Friday morning. I said, "Book it." When I hung up, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my study. My sons, probably. They paused near the door, then moved on. I looked down at the page in front of me, at the neat block letters and the order they gave me. Then I put the phone face down and listened to the house for a while. Friday morning, I drove to the physician's office in a part of town I rarely had reason to visit. It was in a newer medical building near the hospital campus. All glass doors and neutral carpeting and framed prints of trees meant to make people feel calmer than they probably were. The receptionist at the front desk spoke softly, the way people in those offices often do, and handed me a clipboard with forms on it even though most of the information had already been sent over. I filled them out in a waiting room that smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. Name, age, medications, prior medical history, emergency contact. I stared at that last line for a second longer than I expected to. Then I wrote my daughter's name down, paused, and crossed it out neatly. I replaced it with Laura's office number for the moment, not because I intended it to stay that way forever, but because accuracy mattered more than sentiment just then. When the nurse came to get me, she led me down a quiet hall lit by that flat morning light medical buildings always seem to have, no matter the weather outside. The doctor turned out to be a man in his 60s, calm voice, no rush to him. He shook my hand, sat across from me, and explained exactly what the evaluation would and would not be. No mystery, no drama, just process. I respected that. He asked me why I wanted the evaluation. I told him the truth, or enough of it. "I've recently updated my estate planning," I said, "and I want a clean, independent record showing that I'm fully capable of making my own decisions." He gave one short nod, as though he had heard some version of that before and didn't need to decorate it. "All right," he said, "then we'll do this properly." And we did. Questions, dates, recall, judgment, attention, short tasks, longer questions, conversation that sounded casual but wasn't. It was more thorough than what my son had imagined in that hallway recording, and that gave me a certain quiet comfort. Systems worth respecting are usually more complicated than people trying to game them expect. By the end of it, the doctor set his pen down and said, "Mr. Dalton, I don't see evidence of cognitive impairment here. I'll finalize the written report, but from my standpoint, you are fully capable of managing your own financial and personal affairs." I thanked him. He said, "You seem unsurprised." "I'm not." That got the smallest hint of a smile from him. When I walked back out through the lobby, I felt lighter, though not in the triumphant way people sometimes imagine. More like something had clicked into place. One more door shut. One more weak point reinforced. In the truck, before starting the engine, I took out the notepad I'd been carrying and wrote, "Step 1 complete. Independent evaluation done." Then I drew a line beneath it. On the drive home, I stopped for gas and stood there with the nozzle in my hand, watching a crow hop along the curb near the pump island. Ordinary things had started to seem useful to me again. The weather, the smell of gasoline, somebody on the other side of the lot arguing mildly with a teenager about windshield wiper fluid. Life continuing in all directions at once. It kept me from making my situation into something theatrical. By that afternoon, Laura had already called. "I've got enough to move," she said. "The medical report will follow, but I don't need to wait on it to draft. I want to see you early next week." "Good. There's one more thing," she said. "Have you decided what you want to do regarding your son living in the house?" "Yes." She waited. "I want him out," I said. "Properly. In writing. No arguments." "All right," she said. "Then we do that separately, with a clear deadline and no room for confusion." That was the language I wanted. No room for confusion. By then I had lived long enough to know that most family messes survive by hiding inside vague language. "Maybe later. We'll figure something out. Let's not make this formal." I had spoken all of those sentences in one form or another over the years, and every one of them had cost me something. This time, I wanted dates. Terms. A clean line. Over the weekend, I said nothing. That was harder than I expected. My son sat across from me at breakfast Saturday morning and asked if I thought the Vols would cover the spread. His girlfriend loaded the dishwasher badly, the way she always did, bowls tilted so they caught water and came out still dirty. They talked about an apartment complex one of their friends had moved into, but only in the casual way people talk about places they have no real intention of paying for. I listened. I answered where I had to. I kept my face still and my tone even. My daughter called Sunday afternoon. That had been our habit for years. Sunday afternoons, usually around 3:30. She called while walking her dog or folding laundry or driving back from one errand or another, and we talked about ordinary things. The weather, her husband's work, a recipe she'd tried, somebody we both knew getting older in a new and inconvenient way. That Sunday, her voice sounded normal. "Hey, Dad, how's retired life?" "It's quiet," I said. "Good quiet or weird quiet?" "A little of both." She laughed softly. "That sounds about right." There was a clink of dishes on her end. She was probably in the kitchen. Then she said, "You sound tired." I stood at my own kitchen sink while she said it, looking out at the backyard. The feeder moved in the wind. A pair of finches landed and then lifted off again almost immediately. Maybe she meant nothing by it. Maybe she did. At that point, I had stopped trying to sort tone from intent in real time. That could wait. Clarity first. Feelings later. "I've had a lot to think about," I said. "About retirement?" "Among other things." She was quiet for half a beat, then said, "Well, don't overdo it. You've earned a break." There it was again. Rest. Slow down. Let go. Words that sounded gentle until you knew what they had been doing when you weren't looking. I said, "I'll keep that in mind." We spoke another few minutes. Nothing important on the surface. Her dog had chewed through a toy. Her husband was traveling the next week. She was thinking about visiting a friend in Asheville before the weather turned. Then we hung up. When the call ended, I stayed there with the phone in my hand. I wasn't angry. That may sound strange. I had reason to be. But anger would have made me sloppier than I could afford to be. What I felt was more exact than that. I felt finished with pretending not to understand patterns that had been in front of me for years. That evening, I went upstairs to my study and opened the top desk drawer where I kept old family papers. Report cards. My wife's handwriting on Christmas card lists. A school photo of my son missing one front tooth. A note my daughter had written in crooked cursive when she was about 8 that said, "Dad, thank you for building my shelf," with the words running downhill across the page. I looked at those things for a long time, not because they changed anything, but because I needed to remind myself that love and disappointment can sit in the same room without canceling each other out. Then I put everything back in order, closed the drawer, and returned to the legal folder. Monday morning, I met Laura again. She had drafts prepared and flagged in blue tabs. The revised will, the trust structure, updated powers of attorney, trustee language, distribution schedules, specific provisions addressing the business and real property. She walked me through each section in a voice so steady, it almost flattened the emotional charge right out of the room. That was another thing I appreciated. She did not turn my family into a story. She turned it into documents. When we got to the distribution section, she looked up and said, "I want to confirm this again before we finalize. Your children are not being disinherited. They are receiving reduced direct shares. The larger remainder goes where? To the Educational Foundation and the Trade Scholarship Fund, I said. She nodded. And your reasoning? I knew why she was asking. Not for gossip. For the file. I answered plainly. I want my estate to reflect trust where trust is warranted. I also want part of what I built to do some good outside my family. She wrote that down. No speech. No bitterness. Just a clean statement of intent. Then we moved to the letter she suggested I include, not binding, but useful. A personal explanation to be kept with the documents. I had drafted it myself the night before, handwritten first, then typed. She read it in silence. When she finished, she tapped the page lightly. This is strong, she said, because it doesn't argue. That was exactly what I wanted. The letter said I was aware of recent conversations about my property, my capacity, and the future control of my affairs. It said I had reviewed those concerns independently and acted deliberately. It said I loved my children. It also said love did not require me to reward conduct that treated me like an obstacle in my own life. Simple. True. Nothing in it a judge would need to untangle emotionally. We turned next to the house. Laura had prepared a separate notice for my son and his girlfriend. 60 days to vacate. Clear date. Written acknowledgement of temporary financial assistance toward first month's rent and moving costs. No ambiguity that their permission to stay was being withdrawn. No insult in it. No threat. Just terms. I read it twice. The second time, I noticed my own breathing had slowed. Do you want to reduce it to 30 days? She asked. No, why not? Because 60 is fair, I said. And because I want fairness documented too. She sat back a little at that, then nodded once. All right. By the time I left her office that day, I had a signing appointment set for Thursday morning, pending the final medical report being attached to the file. Harold had already reviewed the tax side. Everything was lining up. In the truck, I wrote the next line on my pad. Step 2 complete. Drafts ready. Then below it, Step 3, signed everything before anyone knows. That week, I became very careful. Careful with my keys. Careful with where I left folders. Careful with my computer screen in the study if someone knocked and came in before I could close it. Careful not to change my routines so much that anyone noticed. I still ate dinner at the same time. Still asked my son whether he wanted the last of the cornbread. Still took the trash out Tuesday night. Still answered my daughter's text about whether I had found a mechanic willing to look at an issue with her husband's truck. I answered yes. I'll send you the number. And I did. People imagine strategic decisions feel cold. Mine didn't. They felt exact. That's different. Wednesday evening, my son knocked on the study door. He almost never did that. Usually he just leaned in or called from the hallway. The knock itself told me he wanted something. Come in, I said. He stepped inside and stayed standing, hands in his pockets. A little uncertain, though he covered it well. Hey, he said, you got a minute? I do. He glanced toward the desk where I had already turned the legal papers face down. I wanted to ask you something. All right. He shifted his weight once. Me and Jenna were thinking maybe after the new year we should all sit down and talk about the house. Long term, I mean. Just so everybody's on the same page. I looked at him. Not hard. Not accusing. Just steady. He kept going. Nothing dramatic. Just planning. You know. Making sure things are organized. There it was. Not the whole truth. Not even close. But close enough for him to be testing the ground. I folded my hands on the desk. We can talk when there's something to talk about, I said. He watched me for a moment, maybe expecting more. Then he nodded. Sure, he said. No rush. No, I said. No rush. He gave me a small smile that didn't quite settle right, then turned and left the room. After the door shut, I sat very still. Then I reached over, pulled the legal folder back toward me, and checked Thursday's appointment time one more time. 9 o'clock. The next morning, I was there 10 minutes early. By Thursday morning, I was no longer thinking in broad terms. Everything had narrowed down to sequence. Sign. Confirm. Deliver. Wait. Laura's office was quiet when I walked in. Her assistant offered coffee. I said no. I didn't want anything in my hands except the pen. The final medical report had come in late the day before and was already in the file. Harold's notes were attached where they needed to be. The trust documents were tabbed. The updated will was ready. The property language was clean. The separate notice regarding the house sat in its own folder. Laura came out, held the door open for me, and said, We're ready. Inside her office, everything was arranged neatly across the desk in signed order. That mattered to me. There is comfort in seeing a complicated situation reduced to pages that know exactly what they are for. No raised voices. No guessing. Just lines, paragraphs, initials, signatures, dates. Laura reviewed each item one last time. Not because anything had changed, but because good process does not skip the final pass just because people are tired. This is your revised revocable trust. I nodded. This updates the distribution structure and names the successor trustee. I nodded again. This is the revised will, coordinated to the trust. Then the powers of attorney. Then the supporting letter. Then the separate housing notice. Then acknowledgement pages. Then witness signatures. Then notarization. I signed where I was told. Frank Dalton, again and again. My own name had never looked more like a tool than it did that morning. Useful, binding, clear. At one point, while the notary was stamping a page, I looked out the window and saw a man in a maintenance uniform blowing leaves off the sidewalk below. He was moving slowly and methodically, pushing the same line of leaves farther and farther from the building without ever seeming in a hurry. I remember thinking that order often sounds louder than it feels. Inside the office, the loudest sound was the stamp coming down on paper. When it was done, Laura gathered the signed originals into 2 stacks. One stays here in the vault, she said. One copy for you. One working set for notice. I sat back in the chair. For a second, I felt almost nothing. Then something quieter than relief settled into place. Not pleasure, not victory. More like the silence that comes after a machine finally stops rattling and you realize how much noise it had been making in the background. Laura looked at me and said, "From this point forward, you don't explain. You don't defend. You state. That's the plan." She slid the separate notice for my son toward me. "Do you want this sent, or are you hand-delivering it?" "Sent." "Good. And the letters to both kids?" "Certified mail this afternoon." I nodded. She asked, "Do you want the recording referenced directly?" "Not by content." That's what I thought. The letters had been drafted exactly that way. Brief. Professional. No emotional language. Each one stated that I had recently revised my estate planning and business succession structure after careful review. Each one stated that I was aware of recent private discussions concerning my property, my finances, and my cognitive capacity, and that I had made my decisions accordingly and independently. No threats, no dramatics, just enough reality that nobody could miss what it meant. My son's version included the additional housing notice and a check for a reasonable move-out contribution. First month's rent, security deposit, and a little extra for utilities. I had debated that check for a day and a half. Part of me didn't want to include it, but in the end, I did, because I wanted every piece of this to reflect what it actually was. Not punishment, not revenge. A line. Fairness documented in the same envelope as consequence. Before I left, Laura said, "You may get anger. You may get tears. You may get attempts to reframe this as confusion, outside influence, or instability. I know. Don't meet any of that emotionally. I won't." She held my eyes for a moment, then said, "Good." By noon, the letters were on their way. I drove home with the copy set in a leather folder on the passenger seat and didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need noise. My mind was already moving through what the next 24 hours would likely look like. Delivery times, phone calls, how long it would take for my daughter to open hers, depending on whether she checked the mail herself or her husband brought it in, whether my son would get his from the mailbox or whether I would beat him to the moment simply by being home first. When I pulled into the driveway, his car was there. So was Jenna's. I sat in the truck for a few seconds longer than usual, then went inside. The house smelled like coffee gone stale in the pot, and whatever candle Jenna liked to burn in the den, something sweet that always seemed to me a little too strong for a room with no open windows. My son was at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I came in. "Hey," he said, "you want to grill tonight, or do you want me to just order something?" His tone was normal, friendly. I set my folder on the counter. "Either's fine." He nodded. "Okay." That was it. I went upstairs to my study and shut the door. On the desk, I placed my copies in a single stack and put the supporting medical report in a separate folder marked with the date. Then I sat down in my wife's old reading chair by the window and listened to the house. Footsteps below, cabinet doors, the washing machine starting, a laugh from the den. The whole place still running on assumptions that had already expired. Around 3:30, my phone rang. My daughter. I looked at her name on the screen and let it ring once more before answering. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was tighter than usual. Not loud, controlled, but stretched. "Hi." A small pause. "I got a letter today. I expected you would." Another pause, longer this time. "What is this?" she asked. I was standing by the study window now, looking down at the maple in the backyard. The leaves had thinned enough that I could see the fence line clearly through it. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked once and stopped. "It's exactly what it says it is," I said. "Why would you do this through a lawyer?" "Because legal matters belong in writing." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Dad, come on." I didn't answer that. Then she said, "What does it mean you're aware of recent discussions?" "What discussions?" I could hear the pressure in her voice now. Not panic. Not yet. But pressure. "It means I'm aware," I said. "From who?" "That doesn't matter." "It does matter if somebody is filling your head with things." "No one is filling my head with anything." Her voice sharpened a little. "Then where is this coming from?" "It's coming from me." That line landed. I could tell because the room on her end went quiet for a second. When she spoke again, she had shifted into a different register, more careful, more clinical. "Dad, this is not like you." "I don't agree. You're making major decisions in secret. You're accusing us of conversations you won't even describe. You're changing your estate plan right after retirement, right after Mom." She stopped herself there, but not before using the one word I had known might appear. "Mom." I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the window trim. "I'm not accusing you of anything in that letter," I said. "I'm notifying you of decisions." She said, "This sounds paranoid." I let that sit for half a beat. Then I said, "I've had an independent medical evaluation in the last 2 weeks. My attorney has the report. My decisions are sound, intentional, and final." The silence on her end changed shape after that. Not softer, more calculating. Then she said, "So somebody told you something?" "No, Dad. No, you don't even hear yourself. This is exactly the kind of fear-based thing people do when they're being manipulated." I looked out at the yard. One of the finches had landed on the feeder again. It pecked twice, then lifted its head and looked around before settling back to eat. I said, "No one is manipulating me." I reviewed my affairs. I understood what needed to change. I changed it. "You can't just cut us out." I didn't. That's not what it feels like. I'm not discussing feelings in place of facts. She inhaled sharply. I could picture her by then, standing in her kitchen with one hand on her hip, the letter spread out somewhere nearby, trying different versions of the same pressure to see which one gave. Then she said, "Mom would never have done this." I closed my eyes for just a second, not because it hurt in a theatrical way, because it hurt in a plain one. When I answered, my voice stayed even. "Your mother would have done exactly this," I said. "She would have done it sooner than I did." She made a sound, half protest and half disbelief. I kept going before she could build momentum again. "I love you," I said. "That has not changed. The legal decisions have changed. Those are separate things. Dad, I'm not arguing with you." "So that's it." "For now, yes." She was crying then, or close enough that the edges of her words had started to fray. "This is unbelievable." "No," I said. "It's documented." I heard her take in a breath like she wanted to say something sharper. Instead, she said, "I don't know what's happened to you." I answered, "I'm being clear." Then I told her I loved her again, and I ended the call. I put the phone face down on the desk. Then I stood there and let the quiet return. It didn't take long, maybe 40 minutes. By then the light had started to shift toward evening, turning the study walls a little flatter and more gray. I heard the front door open downstairs, heard my son's voice, heard Jenna ask something I couldn't make out, then a pause long enough that I knew he had opened his envelope. A minute later, there was a knock at the study door. Not casual this time. Free measured knocks. "Come in," I said. He stepped inside holding the letter in one hand and the check in the other. His face had gone pale in the way it does when a person is trying very hard to stay composed because they know anger might make things worse. "Can we talk?" "We can." He closed the door behind him. That, more than anything else, told me he understood the moment. I stayed seated behind a desk. He took the chair across from me without being asked. For a little while, neither of us said anything. He looked down at the paper, then up at me, then down again. Finally he said, "Is this serious?" "Yes." The single word seemed to surprise him more than if I'd given him 3 paragraphs. He swallowed once and set the check on the desk as though it might burn him. "You're really making us leave?" "Yes." He stared at me. "Because of this letter? Because of whatever somebody said? Because of what I know?" His jaw shifted once. He looked like he wanted to deny everything outright, but he didn't. That interested me. It suggested he understood denial might take him somewhere I was already prepared to go. Instead, he said, "You're overreacting. No, we've been helping around here. That's not the issue." "So what is the issue?" I folded my hands in front of me. "The issue is that you have been living in my house under my roof, while speaking about my property and my affairs as though I were already gone or no longer competent to manage them." He went still. Not for long, just long enough. Then he said, too quickly, "I never said that." I looked at him. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I did not offer details. I just looked at him long enough that his own sentence failed to hold. He looked away first. That was the moment the room changed. Because he understood then that I was not guessing, and I understood that he knew it. He looked away first, and once he did, there wasn't much left to debate. That was the thing about the truth in moments like that. It didn't need to be performed. It just needed enough space to stand there by itself. My son kept his eyes on the paper in his hands for a few seconds, then set it down on the desk beside the check. "I said some things," he said. His voice had changed. Lower now. Less certain. Not honest in the full sense, but closer to it than anything he had managed so far. I nodded once. "You did." He rubbed a hand across his mouth and leaned back in the chair. He looked suddenly younger and older at the same time, which I know doesn't make sense until you've seen it. The face of a grown man with the posture of a boy who has run out of places to hide. "It wasn't like that," he said. I let a second pass before answering. "I'm not asking you to explain it." That seemed to unsettle him more than accusation would have. People are often prepared for a fight. They know where to put their hands in a fight. What they don't always know how to handle is a calm refusal to wrestle with what they already know is true. He said, "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I'm sure you'd prefer to think that." He flinched a little at that, and I almost regretted it, not because it wasn't true, but because I had no interest in making pain the center of the conversation. So I brought it back where it belonged. "The practical situation is simple," I said. "The estate documents have been updated. The business structure has been updated. You and Jenna have 60 days to move out. The date in the notice is the date. The check is there to help with the transition. That is the situation." He looked up. "So that's it. That's it. No conversation, no chance to fix it." I considered that. Not long, just enough to answer honestly. "There may be conversations later," I said, "but not ones that undo what has been done." He sat with that. Outside the study window, the light had thinned toward late afternoon. The maple branches moved a little in the wind. Somewhere downstairs, Jenna was pacing. I could hear the faint shift of footsteps now and then in the hall below. He said, "I said I was sorry. I heard you. I mean it. Maybe part of you does." That landed quietly. He looked down again. "What am I supposed to do now?" That question could have taken me backward if I'd let it. Back into being useful in the wrong way. Back into solving for him before he had even stood still long enough to feel the weight of the problem. I had done that too many times already. So I answered differently than I might have years earlier. "You find a place to live," I said. "You make a budget. You take the help that's being offered and you use the 60 days well." He gave a short, humorless exhale. "You make it sound easy." "No," I said. "I make it sound possible." He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment I could see him trying to figure out whether I meant what I had just said, not whether I meant the deadline. He knew by then that I did. Whether I meant the other part, that I believed he could actually do it. "I do," I said before he could ask. He frowned slightly. "Do what?" "I believe you can manage your own life." That shook him more than I expected. His expression changed in a way I can still see clearly. Not hurt exactly. More like recognition arriving late. As if some part of him realized that all those years of rescue had never actually been confidence. They had been doubt dressed up as help. I said, "The net is gone. That doesn't mean the ground disappears." He sat there a moment longer, then nodded once. Not agreement. Not acceptance all the way. But acknowledgement. He stood, folded the notice back into its envelope, picked up the check, and asked, "Do I tell Jenna we really have to go?" "Yes." He gave the smallest, tiredest laugh at that. "She's going to lose it. That's her business." He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. "Are you going to tell my sister everything? I think your sister understands enough already." He didn't answer that. He just opened the door and left. A few seconds later, I heard Jenna's voice in the hallway. Sharp, then lower, then sharp again. My son said something I couldn't make out. A door closed at the far end of the hall. Then the house went quiet in that peculiar, strained way houses do when everybody inside them is suddenly aware of each other. I stayed in the study until after dark, not to avoid them, to let the room settle around what had happened. Around 7:30, I went downstairs, reheated leftover soup, and ate at the kitchen table by myself. I could hear the murmur of voices from the back of the house, but no one came out. After I rinsed the bowl, I locked the back door, turned off the downstairs lights, and went up to bed. That was the first night in a while that I slept without my mind running in circles. Not well exactly, but straight through. Over the next week, the practical side began to move. Apartment websites open on my son's laptop at the breakfast bar. Boxes showing up from a home improvement store, flattened and carried down the hall. Jenna making phone calls on the patio in a voice that tried and failed to stay polite. A lease application printed and left by the printer for half a day before someone picked it up. I stayed out of the mechanics of it. That was important. I answered direct questions when they came. Yes, the utility account in my name would remain mine. No, they could not leave furniture behind indefinitely. Yes, I would honor the amount of the check. No, the date would not be extended casually. Each answer was a sentence or two. Never more than necessary. My daughter did not call again. Not that week. Not the week after. That silence weighed more than I expected it to. With my son, the situation was visible. Rooms changing shape, closets emptying, a stack of dishes that belonged to Jenna disappearing from my cabinets. The practical work of leaving has a way of making reality easier to bear because you can watch it happen. With my daughter, there was none of that. Just absence. Sunday afternoon came and went without the usual call. The first time, I told myself she needed time. The second time, I knew time wasn't the issue. Pride was. Hurt too, probably. Maybe even some real confusion mixed in with the rest. Families almost never break along clean lines. Even when someone is wrong, they still have their own story about why. I missed her anyway. That is another truth people don't like to admit when they talk about boundaries and consequences. You can do the right thing and still feel the loss of it every morning. Those two things do not cancel each other out. A few days later, Melissa called from the store. Not because there was a problem. Quite the opposite. "I just wanted you to know," she said, "the quarterly vendor review went fine. And I moved the holiday stock plan around the way we talked about before you left." I smiled without meaning to. "You didn't need me for that." "I know," she said. "That was the point." We talked for 10 minutes about freight timing, staffing, and a small issue with the delivery schedule. Normal business. Clean, useful, ordinary. When I hung up, I stood in the kitchen a while looking out at the yard and feeling grateful for systems that worked because the people in them respected the work more than themselves. 41 days after the notice, my son and Jenna moved out. Not on the 60th day. Before it, a rented box truck pulled into the driveway just after 8 on a Saturday. 2 friends came to help. There was a good deal of heavy-footed movement, the scrape of furniture, doors opening and closing, one short argument near the truck about how to angle a mattress. I stayed mostly in the den with a book open in my lap, not reading much of it, just keeping myself from hovering. Around noon, my son came in to return the spare house key. He held it in his palm for a second before placing it on the side table by my chair. "We got the apartment," he said. "That's good. It's over near Fountain City." I nodded. "That's a decent area." He stood there a moment. "I start Monday." "At the logistics place?" He looked mildly surprised that I knew. "Yeah." I gave a small nod. "Good." There wasn't a grand reconciliation in that doorway. No speech. No dramatic apology that healed anything. Just 2 men standing in a room that had been rearranged by facts, trying to find a shape for whatever might exist after that. Finally, he said, "I'll pay you back for the check." I looked at him. "No," I said. "Use it to get started." He seemed about to object, then thought better of it. "All right." He picked up the key again, held it out to me directly this time, and I took it. Metal, cool in the hand, lighter than it should have felt. Then he said, "I am sorry." This time it landed differently. Still incomplete, still late, but more real than the first one. "I know," I said. He nodded. Then he left. By 3 that afternoon, the back rooms were empty. I went down the hall and stood in the doorway of what had once been the guest suite. The carpet showed pale rectangles where furniture had blocked the sun. One closet door still hung slightly crooked on the top hinge because I had never gotten around to fixing it. A lonely plastic hanger sat on the floor in one room, and in the bathroom cabinet there was a bottle of aspirin someone had forgotten to take. That was all. No wreckage. No grand emotional scene. Just space. I opened the windows for a while and let the air move through. Then I carried a trash bag in, cleaned out the drawers, straightened the shelves, and changed the bedding in the smaller room even though no one was about to use it. That kind of thing matters. Order after disorder. Hands doing simple work where the mind cannot. My daughter remained silent almost for months. That was the hardest stretch of the whole thing. Harder than the legal work. Harder than the confrontation in the study. Harder, in a way, than hearing the recording itself. Because the recording had at least given me certainty. Silence leaves too much room. There were mornings I'd hear something on the radio she used to love when she was 16 and feel the absence of her like a hand pressing flat against my chest. There were things I almost texted her and didn't. A picture of the first frost on the yard. A ridiculous neighborhood rooster that had started crowing before dawn. A restaurant review for a place she liked when she came by town. Each time I thought about reaching out, I stopped myself. Not out of punishment, because I had spent too much of my life using contact to smooth over what had not actually been repaired. Then, in February, on a Sunday, just after 9 in the morning, my phone rang. Her name on the screen. I let myself look at it for a second before answering. "Hi, Dad." Her voice sounded careful. "Hi." A pause. "How are you?" I looked down at the coffee in my hand, then out toward the feeder in the yard. 2 finches were there, the same pair that had started showing up all winter, hopping and pecking in quick little motions like they had somewhere urgent to be. "I'm all right," I said. "How are you?" "We're okay." Then another pause. Lighter this time. Less loaded. She asked what I'd been doing with myself. I told her I'd started volunteering at the community center on Thursdays, teaching a basic woodworking class for teenagers who needed something to do with their hands after school. That made her laugh softly. "That sounds very you," she said. "I suppose it does." She asked if I was eating properly. I told her yes. I asked about her dog. She told me he had developed strong opinions about the vacuum cleaner. We talked for almost 40 minutes, mostly about small things. Her husband's work. A trip they were considering. A neighbor of mine who had somehow acquired a rooster with no respect for sunrise as a concept. We did not discuss the letters. We did not discuss the recording. We did not discuss the estate. And that was all right. Because the conversation was not pretending nothing had happened. It was simply not forcing repair faster than repair wanted to come. There's a difference. When the call ended, I stood for a while in the kitchen with the phone still in my hand. The house was quiet. The bird feeder moved. Somewhere down the street, a garbage truck stopped and started again. I understood then that consequences had done what they were supposed to do. Not fix everything. Not restore some perfect version of family life that probably had never existed in the way I imagined it. Just establish reality.